This is Dr. Anthony Chang, the founder of AIMed, and thought would be very appropriate to have a brief discussion on how artificial intelligence and COVID-19 relate to each other and how pandemics will be eradicated in the future with the use of artificial intelligence. I think it's a good time to reflect, and I think all of us have had a pause on our busy lives. And Albert Camus in The Plague wrote this about a epidemic, that what's natural is the microbe, all the rest. So our health, integrity, purity is a product of the human will, of a vigilance that must never falter. So I think even Albert Camus in 1947 was prescient to write about what we're facing at this time. So just a brief introduction about pandemics in general. The Spanish flu from 1918 and 1919 actually claimed about 50 million lives. Of course, we have the HIV endemic that has costed 25 or 35 million lives. And in reference to the present COVID-19 pandemic, it's already costed more than 15,000 lives, which is SARS, Ebola, and MERS combined. So even though we have heard a lot about SARS, MERS, and Ebola, the combined lives lost from those pandemics actually are less than what we are experiencing now with COVID-19. I think another important aspect of this is to know a bit about the virus itself. So the virus itself is called SARS-CoV-2, and it's the same family of viruses, coronaviruses, that caused the SARS pandemic. And there's a little bit of confusion with COVID-19. COVID-19 is actually the disease, and the virus is called SARS-CoV-2. So the virus, with its protein spikes that you see on the left there, attaches itself to the ACE2 receptor and facilitated by another protein on the cellular surface of the host, and then it gets into the cell and then replicates itself and causes damage. So the virus has a affinity for lung tissue, and that's where you're seeing a lot of the morbidity. So I think a broad testing protocol at the early stage, which some countries are not doing, coupled with contact tracing, is really the underpinnings of a successful containment strategy. If you look at testing, which has been in the news a lot, on the left you see tests per million people, and on the right you see the size of the population. So the United States is really far behind most other countries in terms of testing the population. If you look on the bottom, South Korea has tested over 3,000 per million people with a smaller population, and Singapore is even more aggressive than South Korea. So you see the countries that have really been able to make headway into containing this virus are the ones that have done broad testing. So in contrary to our American experts' opinions that you've been hearing on the air, we really should be doing a mass testing, and actually mass testing at an interval basis. This is what happens when you do test aggressively, like in China. This is the Hubei province data from the JAMA article. You can see that after lockdown, it still takes 10 to 12 days to see the true effects of the lockdown, because it takes 5 to 10 days for people to manifest the disease, so that you actually have to figure out in a retrospective fashion the impact of the lockdown. So when we're experiencing a lockdown here in the US as in other countries, you're not going to see the effect until 10 to 12 days later. So basically, overall, the earlier the intervention and the stronger the measure, the more effective the overall strategy, and the less time that will be required for these interventions to go on. So on the other end of the spectrum, the later the intervention, meaning containment and mitigation and surveillance, the later the intervention and the weaker these measures, and you see sometimes people still milling about outside despite the recommendation to stay inside, the less effective the strategy and the higher the number of deaths and the higher the case fatality rate. So you can see on the left the graph showing doing nothing, where the number of deaths will be exponentially increased. Mitigation, again, in contrary to what you may have been hearing in the news, is not always as effective as you would like, whereas suppression is a more stringent set of measures, is actually the strategy that will almost guarantee flattening the curve that the pundits have been talking about. So China had a historic quarantine of about 50 million people, and in Wuhan in Hubei province, but it was actually very, very successful in terms of decreasing the number of new cases right away. So I think we can criticize China for this historic and harsh quarantine, but countries like Singapore, Hong Kong in particular, and Taiwan have really been successful in terms of reaching an acceptable equilibrium. So implementing the strategies of intervention to decrease the infections while maintaining economic stability. So none of these countries really took as big a hit as we are here in the US in terms of the economic repercussions of these interventions. So I think for me, I have a global health background and now an AI background as well. For me, there were three important lessons from the global health and AI perspective. I think lesson number one is, as any data scientist will tell you, having good, accurate data and complete data makes all the difference sometimes in projects. So I think early mass testing for the infection, in this case, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and organization of a database really need to be accurate and complete for a successful containment strategy. So no testing means no accurate data, and that's going to really, really get in the way of a successful containment strategy. So lesson number one, early mass testing with a strong database to do some basic analytics for a complete, for a successful containment strategy. So the more active one is about mass testing, and the smarter one is about the data and the organization, I think the less one will need to implement interventional measures for a longer period of time. And that obviously has a lot to do with your economic burden in the future. So this is a nice graph showing deaths by country, and you can see the flattening of the curve in some countries like South Korea and Japan even, and the US remains to be seen, but you can see countries that were not as successful as Singapore and Taiwan, and flattening the curve really took a big hit in terms of number of deaths. So Italy, you see, has a higher trajectory, and Spain as well, although China is starting to flatten. So I think this is a really, really good data visualization of countries that have been successful in using mass testing, tracing, containment, and mitigation, and even suppression to flatten the curve. So I think it's important to mention that mitigation alone may not flatten the curve, and unfortunately that might be a misconception. So I think this you've seen in the news quite often now about flattening of the curve to minimize the healthcare system need and make sure that it doesn't supersede the capacity. But again, mitigation alone may not be enough to bring about this favorable effect. I think lesson number two is how continual disease predictive modeling is so essential for a real-time accurate information to be able to predict resource allocation and to minimize mortality. And I think, again, our Asian colleagues have done a remarkable job with this real-time predictive modeling concept. Here is logistic regression looking at the different predicting mortality and effects of different interventions. So I think very, very important to really leverage data science and artificial intelligence more and more in analyzing the data that is collected by very good public health infrastructure. The third lesson is, I think, the therapeutic interventions really need to be innovative and expedient. This is a molecular model of the SARS-CoV-2 virus with some vulnerable areas that can be attacked by different kinds of medicines. And I think that's really important because especially in countries where the basic public health measures as well as data gathering have failed during the containment and mitigation stages, then one really have the therapeutic interventions as the last line of defense. And this really needs to be much more expedient. So I think we need to really disrupt the traditional approach of multiple phases of a drug trial. And we really need to bend the trajectory of these trials from a linear trajectory, which is traditional. And you see the phase 1 through 3, followed by FDA review in phase 4. We really don't have the luxury of time when you're projecting hundreds of thousands of lives lost. So I think we need to change the trajectory to an exponential one, and also encouraging an international multidisciplinary collaborative effort in order to save lives. And this is, again, traditional way of doing drug discovery or drug repurposing or vaccine development. And I think with the global connectedness leading to such a rapid spread of the virus, for the future, we really need to bend the trajectory and really discover drugs in a much more expedient manner and forego a lot of the traditional methodologies and policies in drugs and vaccine development. So my vision of dealing with COVID-19 in the future is deploying AI in several ways. One, we need a very proactive case identification and tracing strategy that can be automated with daily testing at home that will be wirelessly sent to a data repository for analysis. So that has to be mass screening on a daily level, coupled with a very sophisticated data science-driven modeling that will deploy not just traditional data science and machine learning, but perhaps even deep learning, as there are many nuances to the number of deaths and case fatality rate because of climate change and many other factors. And lastly, we need an innovative AI-derived therapeutic program to expedite the development of drugs and vaccines. So lastly, I think we need both public health strategy that's sound, as well as artificial intelligence methodologies that can give us an advantage. So I think I thought of this war and battle against the viruses in this way. I think going into battle with viruses without a sound public health strategy that involves mass screening and data collection and tracing programs is like going to battle without armor. I think a corollary to that is going into war with viruses without artificial intelligence in the future is like going to war without weapons. So we need both armor and weapons in the fight against viruses. I think if we fail in either or both categories, then unfortunately the human toll is going to be unacceptable. So on a positive note, I think those people on the front lines battling this disease, as well as the patients that are suffering, are really deserving of our utmost effort to institute public health and artificial intelligence for this pandemic as well as future pandemics. And I really dedicate this short talk to those that are really bearing the brunt of the suffering and relieving the suffering for this pandemic. So I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and respect the public health measures, as difficult as these are. But I think it literally will save many, many lives if we all respect these measures. And hopefully in the near future, we'll have the full deployment of artificial intelligence in battling these viral adversaries that we face from now on. So thank you very much, and we will hope to see you soon. Stay safe. Bye-bye.